Good evening, my friends. It is September 5th, 2025, here in Boston, where the early chill of autumn is already hinting at the long winter to come. As I speak, the air is crisp, and the Charles River reflects the fading gold of the season, a scene peaceful to us now. But in the Middle Ages, such skies carried a quiet dread, for in those times, winter was not a poetic season of snow and quiet evenings, but a season of judgment. It chose who survived and who perished, who thrived in strength, and who vanished from memory. The story of medieval winters begins with their result, not their cause. Across Europe, countless lives were measured against the length of a season, and many ended in silence beneath frozen soil. Chronicles record famine, disease, and empty villages left behind by people who could not endure the bitter months. Even kings, sheltered in their castles, were not spared the breath of frost curling against the stones of their chambers. Winter brought a stern equality, a reminder that all were bound to the same fragile earth. Consider the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. A stretch of unrelenting rains spoiled crops across the continent. And when winter descended, it turned hunger into catastrophe. Granaries lay bare, fields turned to mud and ice, and hunger reduced meals to bark, roots, or the boiled leather of old shoes. By the following spring, mortality reached into the millions. In that moment, Europe did not need an invading army to feel crushed. Winter itself was enough. Yet behind this grim picture, there were also strange adaptations, the signs of human persistence. Frozen rivers like the Thames transformed into pathways and markets, where skaters, traders, and revelers danced upon ice that should have been feared. In the Hanseatic ports of the Baltic, merchants grew wealthy by storing grain to release during the leanest months, turning survival into opportunity. In every castle and cottage, people stitched furs, hung heavy draperies, and gathered firewood as though preparing for war. And in truth, it was a kind of war against cold, against hunger, against despair. These struggles extended beyond households to the whole of society. Armies stalled in frozen fields, their supplies exhausted. Horses, the engines of medieval transport and warfare, died in droves when fodder ran out. Political unrest often simmered when peasants saw lords stockpiling while common folk starved. Winter was not only a test of the body, but of the fragile bonds of community. Where compassion failed, riots erupted. Where foresight endured, alliances grew stronger. For us, in the modern age, the brutality of medieval winters may seem like a distant tale, softened by the warmth of radiators and the abundance of supermarkets. Yet echoes remain. We remember the winter energy crisis of 1973, when nations once more felt the chill not of snow, but of scarcity. Today, with shifting climates and fragile supply chains, we understand how quickly comfort can unravel when nature asserts itself. So as we trace the footsteps of those who lived through the medieval cold, let us remember that their hardships shaped societies, economies, and even the course of empires. Winter was not background to their lives, it was an active player, one that humbled kings and peasants alike. Don't forget to subscribe to support this journey and follow along for the next chapters. The kingdom lay silent beneath the weight of winter, as though the land itself had withdrawn into a deep slumber from which it might never wake. The year was 1408, remembered in English chronicles for the bitter cold that descended upon towns and villages alike. The Thames, the great artery of London, hardened into ice so thick that it carried not only men and women, but also the makeshift wooden stalls of a frost fair. The fair has often been remembered in paintings as festive, a curiosity where jugglers performed, merchants roasted chestnuts, and children slid gleefully across the frozen river. Yet beneath the laughter was an undertone of dread, for everyone knew that such freezing meant the earth had locked its harvest away, and survival had become precarious. The merriment itself was a mask, a fragile attempt to resist the stern dominion of nature. The air in London crackled with frost. Every exhaled breath became a ghostly plume, hanging for moments before fading into the grey sky. Ale froze in its tankards. Pies turned rigid before they could be consumed. Horses stamped nervously, their hooves scraping against the ice. Eyes wide with unease at this unnatural road laid across the river. The fair, crowded and noisy, was still haunted by silence whenever the ice groaned. For beneath that ice, the river slept, and the people upon it were trespassers on a surface never meant to bear their weight. Beyond the capital, however, no fairs enlivened the bleakness. In hamlets scattered across England, France, and the German states, cottages crouched like beasts under heavy snow. Thatched roofs sagged, and doors swollen with ice stuck in their frames. The hearth, center of every medieval home, fought valiantly against the chill, but its glow seldom reached beyond the single room where families huddled together. The smell of burning peat and damp would filled the nostrils, acrid and heavy, coating the throat with smoke. Walls sweated with condensation that soon hardened into frost. Within such huts, survival was measured in bundles of firewood and scraps of salted meat. Outside, wolves prowled the frozen landscape, emboldened by hunger. Their howls rolled across the night, a sound that pierced the stillness of sleeping villages and made children cling to their mothers. Livestock, penned in barns of timber and straw, shivered until their bodies failed, leaving behind stiff carcasses that only deepened the fear of famine. The night was no friend in winter. It was a realm where death lurked close, wrapped in the howling of wolves, the crack of branches under snow, and the quiet groans of a roof sagging beneath the white burden of heaven. Even kings, secure within castles, could not banish the cold. The mighty walls of stone that symbolized power became the very conduits of frost, bleeding chill into every chamber. The royal bedchamber, curtained with thick tapestries and surrounded by braziers, still exhaled an icy breath. Servants moved restlessly through the night, feeding fires with logs carried from distant forests. The smell of resin, pine, and smoke hung in the heavy air, but even the glowing hearth seemed small compared to the endless cold pressing in from outside. Queens wrapped themselves in ermine and velvet, while children huddled in beds layered with furs taken from across Europe. Yet still, the cold slipped in through cracks and seams. kingdoms, a patient guest who could never be dismissed. Winter in the Middle Ages was not a season to be endured with ease. It was an adversary, a sovereign that ruled without mercy. The outcome was always the same: fields barren, granaries emptying too quickly, hunger gnawing at bellies, and the steady toll of sickness rising as bodies weakened. Records from monastic chronicles speak of villages where half the children perished before spring. They write in calm Latin phrases, but behind those words lay the bitter truth of small coffins and silent hearths. In those winters, it seemed not that people lived upon the land, but that they merely clung to it, allowed to endure only by the grace of a nature both generous and cruel. The frost touched every aspect of life. Bells of churches froze, their tones duller, their iron stiff. With cold, in marketplaces, silence reigned as stalls stood empty, the wares too meager to fill them. Roads, already poor, vanished beneath drifts of snow, leaving villages isolated, their survival dependent on what had been stored months before. Time itself slowed. Days were short, nights long, and the rhythm of life reduced to waiting. Waiting for the thaw, waiting for the first green shoots of spring, waiting for the mercy of a sun that seemed to have abandoned its children. And so, when one speaks of brutal medieval winters, it is not simply the image of snow and ice that comes to mind. It is the totality of experience, the groaning of ice beneath a crowd, the acrid smoke of a peat fire, the muffled coughs of children huddled in furs, the distant howling of wolves circling a darkened village. It is the outcome etched across kingdoms: hunger, sickness, death, and the quiet endurance of those who, year after year, faced a sovereign power greater than kings. The cruel winters of the Middle Ages did not descend in isolation, like sudden storms. Their brutality was woven into the cycle of the seasons, into the fragile balance of harvest and hunger. When winter arrived, it was often only the final blow delivered to a people already weakened by the failures of autumn. The causes of these brutal winters lay in the soil, the skies, and in the hands of those who depended on them for survival. In the year 1315, Europe was struck by a calamity remembered as the Great Famine. It began not with snow, but with rain. From April onward, the heavens opened, drenching the fields in relentless downpours. Crops drowned where they stood, grain sprouted only to rot, and hay intended for livestock blackened with mold. The very earth seemed to rebel, turning to mud that swallowed plows and left oxen mired to their bellies. When winter followed, it found a continent already stripped of strength. The chronicles describe that year with a mixture of astonishment and dread. In England, the Annals Londinienses noted fields bare of corn, with prices for bread rising to triple the usual. In France, monks of Saint Denis recorded entire villages reduced to eating roots and acorns, their bellies swollen from the harsh fare. The rains had stolen the promise of summer, and the snows finished the work by sealing the land in silence. Thus, the cause of winter's brutality was not the cold alone, but the chain of ruin it completed. For centuries, Europe had lived precariously close to the edge of subsistence. Harvests were uncertain even in fair years, for medieval agriculture relied on wooden plows, fickle soils, and laborers who fought daily against exhaustion. A single failed harvest was a misfortune. Two in succession spelled disaster. By the 13th century, population had swelled, pressing every acre of arable land into use. Forests were cleared, marshes drained. Yet still the yield was meager compared to the mouths it had to feed. This delicate balance made the arrival of harsh winters devastating. When the first frost appeared in late October, it locked away what little remained of the harvest. The granaries, already sparse, became prisons of dwindling supplies. Once the rivers froze, trade faltered. Salt, so vital for preserving meat, became scarce. Livestock, weakened by poor fodder, succumbed quickly, their stiff bodies dragged into pits that smelled of decay even in the frozen air. Thus, by December, families already weakened by thin meals found themselves staring into months of darkness. With little hope, it is tempting to imagine that kings and nobles were immune to such suffering. But the truth is more complex. While lords had greater stores of grain and meat, they too were at the mercy of the seasons. Salted pork, dried peas, and barrels of ale might sustain them. But even their supplies could not last indefinitely. In times of poor harvest, prices for grain soared, and even the mighty struggled to maintain their households. Chroniclers note noble feasts reduced to simpler fare by late winter, the lavish tables stripped of delicacies that had once marked their superiority. In this way, the cause of winter's cruelty touched both high and low. Yet the cold itself was not innocent. The onset of what historians call the Little Ice Age brought harsher, longer winters across Europe. From the late 13th century, average temperatures fell, shortening summers and making harvests more uncertain. Glaciers advanced in the Alps, crushing villages beneath their icy weight. In the North Sea, storms grew more violent, wrecking ships and starving coastal towns of trade. These climatic shifts made every winter a greater threat, for the margin of survival narrowed with each passing year. The causes, then, were multiple. Population stretched beyond sustainable limits, agriculture vulnerable to rain and frost, trade too fragile to rescue the starving, and the climate itself turning colder. Winter became brutal because it arrived at the moment when every weakness in human society was most exposed. It was not only a natural season, it was a force magnifying all other misfortunes. To step into a medieval village in December was too. Sense this truth in every detail. The air smelled of damp straw and smoke. The barns rattled with emptiness. The oxen gone or too thin to work. The church bells rang less often, for there were fewer feasts to mark, fewer weddings to bless, fewer children born alive. Each sound and silence bore witness to the causes of hardship. Every flake of snow falling on the thatched roofs was not merely decoration, it was a weight pressing down upon the thin fabric of survival. Thus, when one seeks the reason why medieval winters were brutal, one must look not only to the cold, but to the chain of calamities that led to it. The rains, the failed harvests, the swollen bellies of starving children, the frozen corpses of cattle, all these were the heralds of winter's reign. The season came not as a solitary tyrant, but as the executioner of sentences already written. In the soil and the sky. Winter in the Middle Ages was not a single blow that struck suddenly. It was a slow tightening, a gradual constriction of choices, until only desperation remained. By the time January arrived, most villages had already consumed the better part of their stores. Barrels of salted pork grew lighter, wheels of cheese shrank to rinds, and sacks of grain that had once seemed abundant dwindled to a handful of meals. The turning point always came when families realized that the rhythm of ordinary life had ended, and survival would demand new, often desperate, strategies. A chronicle from Burgundy tells of women gathering nettles from beneath the snow, their hands raw and cracked, boiling the bitter leaves into broth that smelled of earth and iron. In northern England, moss was scraped from the walls of stone cottages, pressed into cakes with a little flour, and baked over low fires. Such meals were not nourishment, but a way of tricking the stomach into quiet. When even these failed, leather straps from harnesses or old shoes were boiled until they softened enough to chew. Monks wrote of the taste with a strange detachment, but behind their words, one senses the humiliation of those reduced to eating the trappings of their lives. Among the nobility, conditions were less dire but no less telling. At first, their feasts glittered with roasted meats, dried fruits, and spices imported through long trade routes. Yet by February, the lavishness grew thin. The salted venison lost its flavor, the dried peas were served day after day, and the grand tapestries hanging in halls could not conceal the shivering of servants. Even in castles, hunger crept silently, not as starvation, but as a monotony that eroded dignity. The turning point for lords came when their storerooms, once symbols of plenty, revealed their emptiness. These were not simply tales of scarcity, but of the decisions that scarcity forced. In some villages, neighbors bound together, pulling their grain and slaughtering livestock to share among households. In others, suspicion prevailed. Travelers were turned away from gates, their presence feared as both mouths to feed and possible bearers of plague. Hospitality, once a duty sacred in medieval culture, withered in the cold, the hearth that had welcomed strangers now closed its circle, and doors barred with timber told the story of fear. The winter of 1348, when the Black Death spread across Europe, was especially cruel. Hunger weakened bodies already vulnerable to disease. Chronicles from Florence speak of families locking themselves indoors, rationing food so strictly that many starved while trying to avoid infection. The cold crept into these shuttered houses, pressing down upon silence, broken only by coughs. The turning point in such times was no longer merely about food. It was about the will to survive in a world where every breath carried risk. And yet, within these dark accounts, there were also moments of ingenuity. Some villagers learned to ferment nettles and roots into stronger broths. Others hollowed turnips to serve as lamps filled with animal fat, extending their work into the long winter nights. Children, left with little to eat, found play in sliding across frozen ponds, their laughter ringing as a fragile protest against despair. These small acts, chronicled only in passing, reveal the resilience of a people who had learned to wrest life from the margins, one must also consider the role of faith in monasteries. Monks rationed bread and candles, their chants echoing in stone halls, where the cold pressed like a second skin. They recorded the shortages with a mixture of sorrow and resignation, interpreting each famine as a divine trial. Sermons delivered in village churches urged patience and repentance, telling the people that the winter was not only a test of the body, but also of the soul. For some, this belief gave strength. For others, it deepened despair, convincing them their hunger was not merely earthly misfortune, but heavenly judgment. Thus, the turning point of winter was not one moment, but a series of thresholds. The day when bread was baked with husks instead of flour. The evening when a family killed its last goat. The morning when a village closed its gates against outsiders. Each choice revealed both the fragility and the stubborn persistence of medieval life. To imagine such a turning point, one must stand within a cottage in February. The air is heavy with the smell of smoke and unwashed wool. The only light comes from a single hearth, its fire dim, its logs hissing with dampness. A child coughs in the corner, his ribs visible beneath his tunic. On the table lies a pot of nettle broth, bitter and thin. The father, silent, stares into the flames, calculating how many more days the wood pile will last. The mother, weary, draws the blanket tighter around the smallest child. Outside, the snow falls endlessly, muffling the world. Inside, the family waits, balanced upon the knife edge of survival. This is the turning point, the place where ordinary life ends and endurance becomes the only law. The winter did not weigh upon individuals alone. It pressed its hand upon the whole of society, reshaping communities, halting wars, and shifting the balance of power between classes. The silence of the fields and the emptiness of the granaries echoed far beyond the household hearth. They rang through parliaments, monasteries, guild halls, and even the courts of kings. The brutality of winter became not only a private struggle, but a public drama that marked entire kingdoms. In times of plenty, villages were bound together by shared festivals and harvest celebrations. But when the snow lay heavy and famine took hold, these bonds stretched thin. Neighbors who once lent grain or oxen now guarded their doors. Chronicles tell of villages where communal ovens went cold, for no family had enough flour to bake. Suspicion replaced generosity. To share was to endanger one's own children. And so, across Europe, villages fractured. The very structure of trust that bound communities unraveled under the relentless weight of scarcity. Rebellion, too, was a child of winter. In Flanders, peasants rose against their lords in years of famine, angered by the sight of full storehouses guarded by soldiers, while their own families starved. In France, tax collectors were beaten or killed in village squares, accused of stealing bread from the mouths of children. The cold was impartial, but men were not. Lords and merchants with foresight stored grain and released it at high prices, profiting while others perished. The Hanseatic League grew wealthy in this way, controlling the flow of Baltic grain to the markets of Northern Europe. To some, they were saviors. To others, they were profiteers whose ships carried not salvation, but extortion. Armies, too, faltered in the Face of winter. Campaigns planned for glory collapsed beneath snow and ice. Horses, the lifeblood of medieval warfare, died by the thousands when fodder failed. Soldiers marched on empty stomachs, their armor chilled to the touch, their hands too numb to grip. Weapons, chronicles of the 100 Years' War describe encampments, where disease spread faster than courage, and where the only sound at night was the rattling cough of soldiers too weak to fight. Kings who dreamed of conquest were humbled, forced to retreat not by enemy armies, but by the unyielding grip of cold. Yet winter also shaped trade and ingenuity. Merchants along the Baltic coasts stored surplus grain, waiting for the scarcity of February to release their wares at great profit. In London and Bruges, guilds of butchers and bakers set rules to ration meat and bread, preventing riots, but also tightening their grip on the poor. The very scarcity of winter strengthened the hand of those who controlled supply. Social order bent toward those who had power to plan, and the poor, already voiceless, sank deeper into dependence. But not every story was of greed. There were towns where churches opened their granaries, offering bread to the hungry as acts of charity. Monasteries fed not only their own, but also the desperate who gathered at their gates, bowls in hand. Such generosity, while limited, became legends that survived in local memory, proof that compassion could bloom even in snow. These acts also strengthened the spiritual authority of the church, binding peasants in gratitude and devotion. Winter, in this way, not only tested survival, but reshaped the moral balance of the world. The reverberations were also cultural. Songs and tales from the period speak often of winter as an adversary, a beast to be endured. Folklore personified frost as a cruel spirit who stole into homes, or as a grey wolf that circled villages until spring drove it away. These stories were not merely entertainment. They were ways of binding fear into words, of teaching children that survival required vigilance, thrift, and prayer. The brutality of winter was thus inscribed not only in chronicles, but in the very imagination of the people. Consider a town square in January. The fountain stands frozen, its water captured. Mid-splash in crystal silence, the market stalls are empty, their owners absent. A small crowd gathers at the steps of the guild hall, murmuring against rising bread prices. Their voices rise, echoing against the stone, until a soldier disperses them with the threat of steel. This scene, repeated across Europe, shows the reverberation of winter not as a natural event alone, but as a spark of human conflict. Hunger did not merely weaken bodies, it sharpened grievances. The cold also carved lines between classes. In castles, the nobility wrapped themselves in furs, their feasts smaller, yet still warm with firelight. In villages, the poor huddled together, sharing scraps and silence. This contrast deepened resentment. The peasant who saw smoke rising from the manor house while his own hearth lay cold understood that winter was not suffered equally. The reverberation of this awareness carried into politics, fueling later revolts and uprisings that reshaped Europe. Thus, the social consequences of winter were as vast as the snow-covered fields themselves. It halted armies, enriched merchants, strained villages, and deepened class divides. It also inspired acts of rebellion, charity, and folklore that bound people to one another in new ways. The brutal season was not merely endured, it left echoes that shaped societies for generations. Winter was not background, it was an actor upon the stage of history, and its lines were written in hunger, silence, and the murmur of discontent rising from frozen squares. It is tempting to think of the brutal winters of the Middle Ages as relics, as distant events buried beneath centuries of progress. After all, we live in homes warmed by central heating, lighted by electricity, and stocked by supermarkets that deliver fruit from the other side of the globe in mid-January. Yet when we look more closely, we find that the echoes of those frozen centuries remain. Winter, though softened by technology, still whispers reminders of how fragile comfort can be, and how quickly society trembles when supply falters. Consider the winter of 1973, when oil prices surged and nations across the Western world confronted energy shortages. In Britain, the government imposed a 3-day workweek to conserve power. Factories fell silent, and homes darkened as electricity was rationed. People bundled themselves in coats and blankets indoors, as if the medieval hearth had returned. It was not snow alone that made that winter harsh, but scarcity, the same force that gnawed at peasants centuries earlier. What had changed was not the nature of winter, but the tools we used to endure it. Even in recent years, storms remind us of this truth. In 2021, Texas endured a deadly freeze when power grids collapsed under unexpected cold. Houses, unprepared for such temperatures, lost heat, and families melted snow to drink. The scene was eerily medieval. Breath visible in bedrooms, candles lit against the dark, neighbors banding together to share firewood. Though the world had changed, the experience of winter's dominion was the same. A fragile system, tested, revealed just how thin the barrier is between modernity and the old struggle for warmth. These echoes teach us something about the continuity of human vulnerability. In the 14th century, when the Great Famine ravaged Europe, scarcity rippled across kingdoms, creating hunger, unrest, and even war. Today, when fuel prices spike or supply chains falter, we too feel the ripple, though it takes the form of higher bills, rising food prices, or political debate. Winter still has the power to reveal fault lines, whether between lord and peasant in medieval Flanders, or between rich and poor in modern cities. The lesson is sobering. Technology shifts the shape of hardship, but it does not erase it. There is also a deeper echo, one of psychology. Medieval chronicles tell us of villagers who, in the depth of February, lost hope and wandered into the snow, never to return. The long nights, the unchanging gray sky, the hunger that drained not only the body but the spirit, all combined to weigh down the heart. Today, we recognize in milder form the same struggle, calling it seasonal depression. The human mind, still tethered to cycles of light and dark, finds winter a heavy season. Medieval men and women did not name it so, but they felt it in their bones. And yet, just as in those centuries, winter is also a teacher. It asks us to remember that abundance is not permanent, that foresight matters, and that resilience is not measured in plenty, but in patience. The people of the Middle Ages stitched furs, stored grain, rationed candles, and prayed. We insulate homes, diversify energy, and stockpile reserves. The strategies differ, but the underlying truth remains. Survival in winter is always a story of preparation. If we imagine walking through a medieval village and then stepping into a modern city during a blackout, the distance between centuries narrows. Both are filled with the smell of smoke and damp. Both echo with the sound of children's coughs. Both are bound by the hope that spring will come soon. The resonance is not a matter of nostalgia, but of recognition. We are not separate from those who lived in frozen kingdoms. We are simply their descendants, armed with new tools but facing the same eternal season. And so, as we close this chapter, the lesson is not one of despair, but of humility. The medieval winters remind us that no matter how grand our towers, no matter how complex our machines, we are bound to the turning of the earth. Winter remains a sovereign, waiting each year at the edge of autumn to test the bonds of community, the foresight of rulers, and the endurance of ordinary people. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. By the winter of 1316, despair had taken root in Europe like a second crop, more certain in its harvest than any grain. The rains of the previous year had ruined the fields, and now the snow sealed their failure beneath a white shroud. Villages that once buzzed with the rhythm of plowing and threshing stood silent, their barns hollow, their granaries swept clean of every seed. Hunger was not a visitor, but a constant companion, sitting at every hearth, sharing every bed. The famine had reached its second winter, and mortality no longer startled, it was expected. Like the frost that curled each morning across shuttered windows. In England, chroniclers noted that the price of wheat had risen to 6 times its normal cost. Bread, once the humble foundation of life, had become a luxury beyond the reach of common families. In France, peasants were said to have eaten the bark stripped from trees, their teeth stained with wood fibers. In Flanders, livestock dwindled not from slaughter alone, but from disease, for damp stalls had weakened them long before the frost arrived. When the animals died, there was no milk, no leather, no strength for the plows. Each death of a cow or horse was not just the loss of an animal, but of a family's future. The result of this chain of calamity was visible in every village lane. Corpses lay unburied in shallow pits, the ground too hard to dig proper graves. Children's cries grew hoarse until silence replaced them. Mothers pressed empty breasts to their infants, rocking them against the cold while knowing that milk would never return. Priests moved through the streets with thin faces, administering last rites to the old, the weak, and sometimes the very young whose lives had barely begun. The smell of wood smoke mingled with that of decay, a reminder that the living and the dead were forced to dwell side by side in the grip of famine. Even the wealthy felt the shadow of want. Castles that had once resounded with the clatter of feasts now echoed with emptiness. Great halls, lined with tapestries, could not disguise the absence of meat on the table. Wine flowed, but it was bitter comfort against gnawing hunger. The courtiers wore their silks and jewels still, but their faces grew hollow, their laughter edged with unease. No power of king or nobleman could summon harvest from frozen earth. They, too, were subjects under the rule of winter. The famine stretched its fingers into the towns. Markets that had once been crowded with merchants stood nearly bare, where once spices from the east and wool from the Low Countries had been traded in noisy exchange. Now there were only thin stalls selling turnips, dried fish, or whatever scraps could be spared. Coins clinked uselessly in purses, for wealth meant little when there was no bread to buy. Riots broke out in squares, with crowds surging against bakers accused of hoarding. Guards stood watch over mills and granaries, for theft had become as common as prayer. The atmosphere of despair was not only physical, but spiritual. Some believe the famine was divine punishment for sins. In sermons, priests declared that Europe had strayed too far from humility, that the earth's refusal to yield was heaven's rebuke. Others muttered of sorcery, of witches who had cursed the fields, or of Jews accused falsely of poisoning wells. Scapegoats were sought in the same way that food was sought in desperation, with violence not far behind. Yet, amid the wreckage, life continued in strange, diminished rhythms. Families gathered around fires, sharing stories as though words could replace bread. Children learned to chew slowly, stretching small meals into rituals of endurance. The tolling of church bells became more frequent, announcing deaths until their sound seemed a constant part of winter's song. Travelers moved along frozen roads, their cloaks ragged, their eyes hollow, spreading tales of famine from one kingdom to another. The calamity was not confined to one land, but stretched across Europe like a frost that refused to lift. This was the result of harvest's doom. A continent kneeling beneath hunger, kingdoms humbled by the simple failure of rain and soil. It was not an enemy that could be fought with swords, nor a rebellion that could be quelled with force. It was the slow erosion of strength, the hollowing of bodies and spirits alike. And as the snow deepened, so too did the despair, until all that remained was endurance thin, fragile, yet clung to with the stubbornness of those who refused to let winter claim the last word. The famine of the early 14th century was not born in a single season, nor caused by one storm alone. Its roots stretched deep into the fragile foundations of medieval agriculture and the shifting climate that scholars today call the Little Ice Age. The immediate cause of hunger was not simply winter's snow, but the failure of the harvest before it. And when the harvest failed, the winter became not a season of rest, but a sentence of death. The rains began in the spring of 1315. Gentle showers that should have nurtured the grain swelled into endless downpours. Fields that had once been tilled, with wooden plows turned to mud pits where oxen sank to their knees. Wheat sprouted in patches, yellowed and drowned. Barley rotted on the stalk, and hay meant for livestock lay blackened in sodden meadows. From Ireland to Poland, the story was the same. Crops perished beneath skies that refused to clear. Villagers looked upward, imploring heaven, but the clouds only answered with more rain. By summer, disease spread through the damp fields. Ergot fungus, that dark blight of rye, took root, poisoning the little bread that was harvested. Livestock suffered. Cattle caught foot rot, their hooves soft and swollen in the mire. Horses, thin and weary, faltered in the fields, unable to pull plows through the sucking earth. When animals weakened, so did the people who relied on them. For in the Middle Ages, the boundary between man and beast was narrow. The health of the herd was the health of the household. The problem was worsened by Europe's swollen population. In the decades before the famine, prosperity had encouraged growth. Forests were cleared, marshes drained, every corner of arable land pressed into service. Yet medieval farming techniques offered little surplus. A single poor harvest could be endured, but two in succession spelled calamity. By 1315, the margin for survival was so thin that when the rains came, there was no buffer. Villages lived harvest to harvest, with scarcely enough reserves to withstand the failure of one season, let alone two or three. The granaries emptied swiftly. By autumn, communities that had once stored grain in bins or clay jars found them already half consumed. Prices rose sharply. A bushel of wheat in England that once cost 6 shillings now commanded 20. Families sold tools, clothes, and even their homes for food, yet still the hunger deepened. The poor, who had nothing left to trade, turned to theft or begged at monastery doors. Even there, supplies dwindled. Monks recorded with sorrow how their bread lines lengthened until they could feed no more. Winter descended upon this misery. Like a second verdict, the cold froze the sodden ground, locking away whatever might still have been salvaged. Travel became difficult, cutting off trade between towns. Salt, essential for preserving meat, grew scarce, for merchants could not deliver it along frozen roads. Fish, a staple of medieval diets, were trapped beneath ice or spoiled without proper curing. In this way, the causes of famine compounded one another, each misfortune tightening the noose. The immediate cause, then, was not only the weather, but the delicate fragility of the system itself. Agriculture depended on tools that broke easily, animals that sickened quickly, and soils that yielded grudgingly even in fair years. There were no chemical fertilizers, no iron plows, no sophisticated irrigation. A village's fortune rested on the rhythm of the seasons, and when that rhythm faltered, despair followed. One must imagine the rhythm of a medieval household to see this clearly. In April, seed was sown. By June, the first shoots appeared. In August, the harvest was gathered and stored. Through autumn, families preserved, salted, dried, and counted their reserves. By Christmas, they knew whether their stores would carry them through the winter. In 1315, and again in 1316, that cycle collapsed. Sowing was drowned, shoots rotted. Harvests failed, and the stores were bare by November. The entire year unraveled, leaving winter to finish what autumn had begun. And yet, there was another layer. Human choices, lords demanded rents, and tithes even in years of scarcity, seizing grain from peasants who had nothing left for themselves. Kings levied taxes to fund wars, diverting resources that might have fed villages. Merchants hoarded supplies, waiting for prices to rise, and released them only at the height of desperation. Thus, the immediate cause of hunger was not only nature, but society itself, sharpening the edge of calamity. When we read the chronicles today, we find not just descriptions of storms, but laments of injustice. "The poor starved," wrote one monk in France, while the barns of the great remained closed. This simple line reveals much. The rains may have ruined the fields, but it was human greed and rigidity that turned hardship into catastrophe. The doom of the harvest was both natural and man-made, a reminder that disaster seldom arrives without the hand of man pushing it forward. Thus, the cause of winter's brutality was clear: rain-soaked fields, diseased livestock, fragile tools, swelling populations, and the grasping hands of those who ruled. Together, they conspired to deliver a continent into the jaws of famine. The snow that fell in December was not the beginning of suffering, but its culmination. The seal upon a fate written months earlier in the sodden earth, the crisis of harvest. Failure always carried within it a moment when endurance hardened into desperation. This turning point did not arrive in one instant, like a sword striking. It came gradually, creeping through villages and towns until everyone realized that the ordinary ways of life no longer sufficed. By midwinter of 1316, across much of Europe, that realization had taken hold. The harvest had failed again. The granaries were empty, and families faced a choice not between comfort and hardship, but between survival and surrender. Accounts from England tell of villagers mixing ground acorns and husks into their bread. The loaves, heavy and bitter, filled the stomach but offered little nourishment. Chroniclers in France wrote of families boiling the bones of animals long since consumed, drinking the thin broth as though it contained sustenance. In some German towns, horse hides were softened in boiling water and eaten. The tough leather gnawed as though it were meat. Such meals marked the threshold of desperation. When people ceased eating food and began consuming whatever could keep hunger at bay. It was during this stage that communities divided. In some villages, neighbors bound together, pooling their meager supplies and rationing them so that no one would perish too quickly. In others, suspicion triumphed. Doors once left open to kin and strangers alike were bolted, and every knock was met with fear. Travelers were turned away at town gates, their hollow faces and ragged clothes viewed not as signs of suffering, but as threats. The sacred duty of hospitality, cherished for centuries, withered in the frost. Winter became a season of isolation as well as hunger for the nobility. The turning point was quieter, but no less stark. Their kitchens, once filled with the aromas of roasting venison and spiced wine, grew subdued. By February, the salted pork barrels were low. The dried peas served daily until monotony dulled appetite. Tapestries still glowed upon the walls. Candles still flickered in chandeliers. But beneath the splendor lay a gnawing awareness. Even the great households were shrinking into survival. The lords might not starve, but they felt the same tightening of options. The same monotony that ground down the spirit. It was in monasteries, however, that the change was recorded with the greatest clarity. Monks kept careful notes of their rations. At first, each received bread and ale, perhaps a piece of cheese or fish. As the famine deepened, the bread shrank, the ale was watered, The cheese vanished. By Lent, many monasteries were feeding not only their own, but crowds of villagers. At their gates, their records speak of loaves divided thinner and thinner, candles extinguished early to save wax, and brothers collapsing in the choir stalls during prayer. The turning point for them was when devotion was weighed against exhaustion and survival. Became a form of penance. Faith played its role in how people endured this threshold. Priests preached that famine was a punishment for sin, urging confession and repentance. Pilgrimages were undertaken, barefoot journeys through snow to distant shrines in hope that heaven might relent. Relics were paraded through towns, saints invoked, processions made beneath grey skies. Some found solace in this faith, others found bitterness, wondering why their prayers seemed to vanish into the clouds. At the turning point of famine, belief itself was tested alongside the body. There were darker responses too. Rumors spread that witches had cursed the fields or that Jews had poisoned wells. Desperate for explanation, communities lashed out. Pogroms erupted in some towns. Violence layered upon hunger. Scapegoats bore the burden of nature's cruelty, as if hatred might fill the stomach or anger coax grain from frozen soil. This, too, was a turning point, the moment when famine transformed from private suffering into social violence. And yet, despite despair, ingenuity appeared. Chronicles mention villagers fermenting roots into crude drink or hollowing turnips to burn. Animal fat as lamps. Children made games of gathering wood chips or sliding on frozen ponds, their laughter briefly defying the misery. These small acts, insignificant in records, reveal how humans resisted despair even when food was gone. The turning point was not only a fall into desperation, but also a pivot toward resilience, where every scrap of life was made to serve. Imagine, then, a household in February. The father sits at the table, his face gaunt, his hands rough. Before him is a bowl of broth, thin and green with nettles. His wife divides a crust of bread among their children, each piece no larger than a coin. The fire burns weakly, logs hissing. With dampness outside, snow drifts against the door, muffling the world. The children eat slowly, savoring every crumb. The parents watch in silence, their own hunger pushed aside. This scene, repeated across a continent, was the turning point, the moment when survival was no longer about living well. What about enduring it all? The famine of 1315-1317 did not confine itself to empty stomachs or shivering bodies. Its force rippled outward, unsettling villages, towns, kingdoms, and even the conscience of Christendom. The failure of the harvest became more than an agricultural crisis. It was a social earthquake that reshaped the order of Europe. Hunger, once a private torment, became public unrest. Scarcity became rebellion. And the cold months, stretching longer than memory, turned neighbor against neighbor, lord against peasant, and community against itself. In the villages, the first cracks appeared in the bonds of trust. Normally, rural life was sustained by cooperation. Families shared plows, exchanged seed, and helped each other bring in the harvest. But famine corroded these ties. Those who had a little grain hid it beneath floorboards or sealed it in jars. Buried under earth, suspicion sharpened like frost on the eaves. A neighbor who once lent freely was now viewed as a thief in waiting. At night, barns were raided, chickens stolen, root cellars emptied, villages that had sung together at harvest. Festivals now accused one another in whispers, the cold air thick with fear. Riots broke out in towns and cities. In St. Denis, angry crowds stormed bakeries when bread vanished from the stalls. In Bruges, guilds clashed with merchants accused of hoarding grain, their shouts echoing down narrow streets. Even in London, the chroniclers report fights at the doors of mills, where women jostled and scratched for the chance to buy a handful of flour. Hunger turned markets into battlegrounds, where coins no longer guaranteed food and law bowed before desperation. Lords and kings were not spared from the judgment of their people. Peasants rose in protest against rents that had not been lowered, against taxes that drained them of their last resources. In France, rumors swirled of noble storehouses filled with grain, while villagers starved outside. Their gates, armed mobs gathered, sometimes dragging stewards from their houses and beating them to death in the snow. Winter made rebellion possible, for when survival was denied, fear of authority diminished. The famine thus did not only weaken bodies, it weakened the bonds of feudal obedience. The church, too, felt the tremors. Monasteries that opened their granaries became sanctuaries, remembered for centuries in local memory as havens of compassion. With others, unwilling or unable to share, earned the hatred of the hungry. Priests thundered from pulpits that the famine was divine punishment, demanding repentance and penance. Yet their sermons sometimes fell on ears too weary to listen. Faith was tested as never before. Some found strength in prayer, while others doubted a God who allowed children to starve. The famine thus reshaped not only politics, but piety, leaving scars on the spiritual landscape of Europe. Commerce shifted as well. The Hanseatic League, with its great storehouses in Lübeck and Hamburg, profited by releasing grain at inflated prices. Their ships became both lifelines and symbols of greed. Local merchants followed suit, waiting until hunger reached its height before selling their stock. The famine made clear that control of food was control of power. Wealth was no longer measured by gold or silver, but by sacks of rye, by salted herring, by the keys to a granary door. This realization rippled through society, hardening the sense of inequality between those who could hoard and those who could not. The famine also altered warfare. Campaigns stalled, not because of enemy strength, but because soldiers could not march on empty stomachs. Horses died in droves, their carcasses left frozen on roadsides. Armies dissolved in the cold, disbanding not through defeat, but starvation. Winter thus became a force greater than kings, able to halt wars and reshape treaties. Even culture bore the imprint of these winters. Songs and tales took on darker tones, speaking of hunger as a beast that prowled the land, devouring young and old alike. Folklore painted famine as a spirit with hollow eyes and a mouth that never closed, following families from hearth to hearth. These stories were not mere inventions. They were attempts to give shape to suffering, to weave meaning into the silence of empty nights. Children grew up hearing them, learning early that survival depended not only on strength but on foresight. And unity. One might picture a marketplace in Bruges, January 1317. The stalls stand nearly bare. A baker, guarded by soldiers, sells bread no larger than a fist for the price of a week's wages. A woman shouts, accusing him of theft, her children clinging to her skirts. The crowd swells, voices rising, until fists fly. A soldier raises his sword, but the mob surges forward, scattering grain upon the cobblestones where men and women fall to their knees, scrambling for crumbs in the snow. This was the famine's true reverberation, the dignity of society fractured, the bonds of law and order stripped bare by hunger. Thus, the harvest's doom was not merely a failure of crops, but of the structures that bound Europe together. It turned villages inward, towns violent, peasants rebellious, lords defensive, merchants calculating, priests uncertain. It revealed that beneath the surface of order lay fragility, that scarcity could unravel the tapestry of feudal life. The snow that covered the fields was also a shroud draped over society itself, hiding a body weakened, fractured, and trembling. The memory of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 lingers not only in chronicles, but in the hidden structure of our present world. Though centuries divide us from the peasants who boiled nettles and gnawed leather, the echoes of their hunger still sound in our own age. For famine was never only about empty fields. It was about the fragility of systems, the vulnerability of trade, and the dependence of human life upon forces it cannot fully command. The same truths remain with us today. Modern society imagines itself armored against such calamities. We live with granaries that stretch into silos, refrigerated ships that cross oceans, and markets that can deliver oranges in January or coffee in the dead of winter. Yet beneath this abundance lies the same precarious thread. In 2020, when global supply chains faltered under the weight of a pandemic, supermarket shelves emptied in wealthy nations that had not known scarcity for generations. It was not snow or rain that stripped the shelves, but a sudden reminder that trade, like harvest, can fail. The sight of lines for bread or flour, though brief, evoked memories buried deep in European history. Energy, too, has become our new harvest. In the winter of 2022, as war in Ukraine disrupted gas supplies, Europeans once more faced the prospect of cold rooms and rationed heat. Governments urged citizens to wear sweaters, to lower thermostats, to endure. The words were modern, but the experience was ancient. Scarcity pressing into the heart of winter, reshaping politics, stirring unrest, just as villagers once cursed their lords for hoarding grain. So too did citizens accuse leaders of mismanagement, corruption, or indifference. The pattern was familiar, though the objects had changed. Climate change adds another echo, where the Little Ice Age brought cooler summers and relentless rains. Our century brings droughts, storms, and shifting patterns of fertility. Farmers in regions from California to the Sorrel speak of uncertain harvests, of rivers that run dry or skies that refuse to rain. When harvest falters, so too does the web of life built upon it. Prices rise, migrations begin, and unrest follows. The lesson of the 14th century is that hunger is never confined to fields. It spreads into politics, faith, and war. The echo of famine is not silence, it is turmoil. There is also the echo within the human spirit. Medieval chronicles speak of despair, of men and women who lost not only strength, but will. Today, psychologists recognize in famine's shadow the corrosive effect of hopelessness. During modern crises, be they economic downturns, pandemics, or climate disasters, the language of despair emerges again. We find ourselves using metaphors of hunger and starvation. Even when our cupboards are full, the echo of the Great Famine is etched into our imagination, a ghost that reminds us how thin the line between abundance and ruin can be. Yet, like our ancestors, we also find resilience. In 1317, communities that survived were those that pooled resources, shared grain, or trusted one another. In 2020, when shelves were bare, neighbors shared flour, yeast, and toilet paper with the same instinct. The form changes, but the impulse endures. Winter, whether medieval or modern, tests not only the body but the fabric of community. The famine's greatest lesson is not that hunger destroys, but that solidarity can endure even in snow. To walk through history is to see ourselves reflected in older glass. Imagine a peasant woman in February 1317, holding her child close, whispering promises of spring while offering him a crust of bark bread. Now imagine a parent in 2021, holding a child in a cold apartment during a blackout, whispering that the lights will return soon. The distance of centuries is real, but the bond of experience is closer than we wish to admit. Both are bound by the same human thread, the will to comfort in the face of scarcity, the hope that tomorrow will be warmer, fuller, kinder. Thus, the doom of the medieval harvest is not merely a chapter closed. It is a reminder that prosperity rests on fragile ground. Our fields may be global, our silos vast, but the dependence remains. Nature still holds the balance, and society still reveals its fractures when scarcity presses too hard. The echo of the famine warns us to prepare, to share, and to remember that no abundance is eternal. And so, as we close this chapter, we return to the lesson carved into the cold centuries. Harvests fail, winters bite, and yet humanity endures. It endures not by denying the hardship, but by facing it, by binding together, by remembering that the cold is always temporary, that spring always waits. The people of 1317 did not all survive, but their memory teaches us still, across the gulf of time, how to endure. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. By the late winter of 1348, survival itself had become the measure of life in Europe. Villages that once counted their worth in livestock, tools, or fields now measured it in the simple ability to endure until spring. Those who survived did so, not with plenty, but with scraps nettles boiled into thin broth, leather softened in pots, and bark stripped from trees. The chronicles speak of desperation not as an exception, but as a way of life. What had once been seen as shameful consuming, weeds, boiling straw, grinding husks into bread had become ordinary. This was the result of famine's long hand. It normalized the unthinkable, transforming dignity into endurance. In Burgundy, a record tells of villagers gathered around a pot of broth brewed from roots and nettles, the liquid so bitter that even children grimaced, but drank nonetheless. In Yorkshire, families baked bread mixed with ground acorns, their teeth stained dark from the husks. In Saxony, leather belts and harness straps were boiled until softened, then cut into strips and eaten as though they were meat to modern ears. These accounts sound grotesque, yet in the winter of survival they were lifelines. Hunger stripped away distinction. Noble and peasant alike were reduced to seeking nourishment wherever it might be found. The plague compounded the misery in 1348. As the Black Death spread across Europe, weakened bodies stood little chance of resistance. Hunger made people frail, cold made them vulnerable, and despair dulled their spirits. The result was catastrophic. In towns like Florence and Avignon, entire households vanished within weeks. The chronicles describe streets lined with the dead, their bodies carted away in silence. The turning point of survival was cruelly intertwined with the turning point of death. Even those who managed to find food discovered that it could not shield them from disease. Yet survival left its traces. Some families endured where others failed. The survivors were often those who adapted, who abandoned pride and embraced necessity. They ate weeds, scavenged for roots, begged when needed, stole when desperate. In this way, survival was not measured by strength, but by flexibility, by the willingness to do what had once seemed beneath dignity. Those who clung to old notions of honor, refusing to beg or consume strange fare, perished. The chronicles are filled with such silent lessons, though seldom spoken aloud. The landscape itself bore the scars of survival. Fields lay empty where laborers had died, their tools rusting in the soil. Orchards stood unharvested, their fruit rotting where no hands remained to pluck them. Villages shrank, leaving half-collapsed cottages with doors swinging open in the wind. Yet amid the ruins, smoke still rose from chimneys, proof that some endured. These survivors became the foundation of a changed Europe, carrying forward memories. Etched by hunger and cold. Picture a February evening in a small French village. The snow drifts high against the cottages, muffling every sound. Inside, a family sits close to a dim fire. On the table is a bowl of nettle broth, shared between 5. The father divides it carefully, his face gaunt, his hands trembling. The mother hums softly to the youngest child, though her voice cracks with weariness. Outside, the wind moans against the shutters. Inside, silence reigns except for the faint clink of spoons. They do not speak of tomorrow. They think only of tonight. This is survival, not triumph, not abundance, but the quiet refusal to yield. The result of these long winters and failed harvests was not merely death. Though death was abundant, it was the reshaping of what it meant to live. Dignity was stripped, pride was surrendered, and survival became the only measure of success. For those who endured, memory itself became a burden. For to survive was also to remember the faces of those who did not. Thus, when we speak of the turning point of survival, we speak not only of endurance, but of the quiet grief that clung to the survivors, the knowledge that their lives had been bought with the silence of others. The desperate meals of nettle broth, bark bread, and boiled leather were not accidents of whim. They were the direct consequence of forces that pushed ordinary households past the edge of endurance. To understand why survival in the mid-14th century required such humiliations, one must look to the causes that narrowed choices until only desperation remained. The immediate cause of this turning point was twofold: the failure of food supplies during successive harsh seasons, and the shadow of plague that crept across the land. Together they cornered Europe's people into a test of survival unlike any they had known. First came the problem of supply. By 1347, harvests across parts of Europe had faltered. The cooling climate of the Little Ice Age shortened summers, leaving grain less time to ripen. Rains in some regions rotted crops, while drought in others left fields cracked and barren. The delicate balance of medieval agriculture, so dependent on weather, so vulnerable to pests, collapsed. Granaries that once held the promise of bread until spring stood half empty by November. Meat, usually preserved in barrels of salt, became scarce when herds shrank from lack of fodder. By January, families had already begun to ration. By February, they were experimenting with substitutes. Salt, the lifeblood of preservation, compounded the problem. When roads froze or storms lashed the coasts, shipments faltered. Without salt, fish spoiled, meat decayed, and what might have carried a household through winter rotted before it could be consumed. The immediate cause of hunger was not simply the absence of food, but the loss of the means to keep it edible. In villages where salt could not be purchased, families slaughtered livestock early, consuming fresh meat in weeks when it might have lasted months. Thus, by midwinter, they found themselves with nothing but memories of abundance. And then came plague. In 1347, ships carrying the Black Death arrived in Mediterranean ports. By 1348, it had swept inland. The disease struck with terrifying swiftness. Fevers, swellings, blackened skin, death within days. Hunger had already weakened immune systems, leaving men and women unable to resist. Those who might have endured thin rations fell swiftly when disease entered their homes. The plague was not caused by hunger, but hunger made it deadlier. The two calamities intertwined, creating a vicious cycle where scarcity bred weakness, and weakness bred death. Fear spread faster than either famine or plague. Villages barred their gates, towns closed their markets, neighbors avoided one another. Trade faltered not only because of frozen rivers, but because of terror. A merchant who might once have brought grain from another town stayed home, fearing contagion. Roads grew empty except for processions of the desperate, families fleeing in hope of food, beggars wandering from door to door, priests carrying relics in search of divine mercy. The circulation of goods and people that might have offered relief instead collapsed. The immediate cause of desperation was not only the weather and the plague, but the paralysis of society under fear. One must also consider the feudal order. Lords demanded rents and tithes even as their peasants starved. Kings levied taxes to fund wars even when villages were crumbling. These demands drained what little remained. When peasants had no coin, they surrendered grain. When they had no grain, they gave livestock. When they had no livestock, they gave themselves to labor, weakening further under exhaustion. The system itself, rigid and unyielding, stripped households of resilience. What might have been endured became unbearable under the pressure of obligations that recognized no famine. Religion played its part in shaping the crisis. Priests declared that famine and plague were punishments for sin. People responded with fasts, pilgrimages, and penance acts that further weakened their bodies. Men and women walked barefoot in the snow, hoping that their suffering might soften divine judgment. They lashed themselves in public squares, their cries echoing against the stone walls of towns. Such penance did nothing to restore the harvest or halt the disease, but it drained energy and spread despair. The immediate cause of survival's desperation was thus spiritual as well as physical. People believed themselves condemned, and belief itself weighed upon their bodies. Imagine a household in the Rhineland. It is January. The family gathers in a cold room. The fire low. They have slaughtered their last pig. Its meat, without salt, has spoiled in the cellar. The father has taken the hide, boiled it in a pot, and cut it into strips. The children chew the leather with difficulty, their jaws aching, their eyes wide with confusion. They do not understand why their food tastes of nothing but smoke and bitterness. Their mother, too weak to speak, lies beneath a blanket, coughing. Outside, snow falls upon the silent fields. Inside, the family faces the immediate truth. There is nothing left. This scene was repeated countless times. Each household pushed to the same edge by the same causes: failed harvests, spoiled stores, demands of lords, fear of plague. Thus, the turning point of survival was not a choice freely made, but a trap sprung by circumstance. Nature had failed, society had failed, and fear had spread. What remained was endurance through means that seemed grotesque, yet were utterly rational in the face of starvation. The nettle broth, the bark bread, the boiled leather, these were not signs of madness but of clarity. They were the proof that survival had narrowed to the smallest possible options. And so, when we search for the immediate cause of medieval desperation, we find it not in one field or one town, but in the intersection of climate, hunger, disease, fear, and obligation. Together, they made survival an act of invention and dignity a luxury few could afford. The moment when hunger became desperation, when ordinary life cracked and survival alone remained, was seldom recorded in grand chronicles. It did not arrive with a trumpet blast or a royal decree. It arrived quietly in kitchens, barns, and fields, as families realized that the stores would not last. The turning point of survival was not a single day, but a slow erosion of choices, until dignity gave way to necessity. In England, household accounts show the shift. At the start of winter, bread was still baked from pure wheat or rye, though in smaller loaves. By mid-January, husks were mixed in, then acorns, then ground beans. By February, bread had lost resemblance to bread, a bitter, heavy lump that mocked the memory of abundance. In France, villagers turned to foraging in frozen forests, scraping bark from trees, digging through snow for roots. Children learned to distinguish edible from poisonous plants, not from books, but from hunger's urgency. The turning point lay not in the food itself, but in the silence with which these humiliations were accepted. Chroniclers describe people who once scorned begging, kneeling at monastery gates, bowls in hand, pride dissolved before starvation. In towns, laborers offered to work for nothing but a crust of bread, their tools abandoned as useless. Even among the nobility, restraint crumbled. Nobles who once measured their status by lavish feasts now sat at tables where meals repeated endlessly: peas, beans, black bread, weak ale. The glow of candles could not mask the hollowness of their faces. The turning point was marked by this leveling force. Hunger reduced all to the same struggle, blurring the lines between wealth and poverty, though never erasing them entirely. And yet, it was not only food that marked the shift. It was the choices people made when hunger sharpened every edge. Some stole from neighbors, others abandoned children, leaving them at monastery doors in hope of mercy. Families split apart, the stronger wandering in search of food while the weaker remained behind. In German chronicles, there are stories of villagers raiding grain stores at night, their footprints in the snow traced by soldiers come morning. Punishments were harsh, yet desperation bred repetition. The turning point was when crime lost its stigma, when survival justified theft. Faith both deepened and fractured at this moment. Some saw the famine and plague as judgment and turned to prayer with fervor. Processions marched barefoot through snow. Banners of saints held high, chants rising into the cold sky. Others, disillusioned, withdrew from churches, whispering that God had abandoned them. Superstition flourished. Rumors of witches, curses, and poisoned wells spread, and mobs sometimes took justice into their own hands. The turning point of survival was not merely physical, but spiritual. The old certainties of faith wavered, and with them, the cohesion of communities. The plague added terror to hunger. When illness entered a household already weakened by famine, the results were swift. A father might collapse in the fields. A mother might cough blood by the fire. A child might be buried before dawn. Neighbors, fearful of contagion, avoided the sick, leaving families to fend for themselves. Some villages fell silent in a single week. The turning point here was more than hunger. It was isolation, as fear severed the bonds of community. Survival became an individual task, and loneliness deepened the cruelty of winter. But alongside despair, ingenuity persisted. Villagers learned to dry nettles for storage, to trap birds in the snow, to stretch flour with ground beans and chestnuts. In monasteries, monks experimented with brewing thin ales from whatever grains remained. Their bitter taste tolerated because it provided calories. In towns, bakers produced famine bread, thick loaves made of husks, moss, and scraps of flour. These inventions were born of necessity, and though unappetizing, they sustained life. The turning point was not only the fall into desperation, but also the rise of resilience. The stubborn insistence on finding nourishment where none seemed to exist. Imagine a family in February 1349, in the shadow of plague and famine alike. They sit in a cottage dimly lit by a single fire. On the table lies a small loaf, dark and heavy with ground acorns. The father divides it into 5 pieces, his hands trembling not from fear, but from weakness. The mother presses a piece into the child's palm, urging him to chew slowly. No one complains. They know there is nothing else. Outside, the snow falls, covering the fields where no crops grew. Inside, silence reigns, broken only by the sound of chewing, as though each bite were a prayer. This scene, repeated across kingdoms, was the true turning point, when survival itself became the only purpose of life. Thus, the turning point of survival was not one event, but 1,000 small surrenders. The first time bark was ground into bread, the first time a man begged, the first time neighbors locked their doors against one another. Each moment chipped away at dignity until survival alone remained. And yet, these same surrenders preserved life, carrying a battered Europe forward into whatever spring might follow. The turning point of survival was not confined within cottages, barns, or cloisters. It rippled outward, unsettling the very structure of medieval society. Hunger, once born in silence within families, spilled into streets and fields, changing how communities functioned, how rulers ruled, and how faith was practiced. Famine and plague together became a great revealer, stripping away the illusions of stability that kingdoms had cultivated in villages. The first cracks appeared in trust. Neighbors who once worked side by side now watched one another with suspicion. A man who shared grain might be repaid not with gratitude, but with theft. As desperation overcame bonds of kinship, doors that had stood open during harvest festivals were barred, and fences grew higher, not to keep animals in, but to keep hungry neighbors out. The spirit of the common shared tools, shared ovens, shared fields eroded under the pressure of survival. In its place rose a culture of guarded silence, each household retreating into itself. Towns swollen with refugees from the countryside became pressure points. Marketplaces turned violent when supplies ran short. In Florence, officials struggled to enforce price controls on bread. Yet bakers smuggled loaves to the wealthy while the poor fought over crusts. In Bruges, chroniclers described riots in which grain carts were overturned, their contents scattered on the snow and seized by frantic hands. Soldiers patrolled streets. But even steel could not suppress hunger's fury. Winter transformed towns from centers of commerce into theaters of unrest. The nobility faced their own trials. Castles, once symbols of strength, became fortresses of anxiety. Lords who continued to demand rents and labor in years of famine found their peasants rebellious. In Normandy, armed bands of peasants refused to pay dues, declaring that survival left them nothing to give. Some lords, fearful of revolt, reduced obligations or opened their stores. Others doubled their demands, sparking violence. The feudal bond, built on the exchange of protection for service, faltered when protection failed. Winter revealed how fragile the contract between lord and peasant truly was. The church, too, was shaken. On one hand, monasteries that opened there, granaries became lifelines, remembered for generations as places of mercy. On the other hand, when churches hoarded or when priests preached punishment instead of compassion, resentment flared. Faith was tested by hunger. Pilgrimages and processions multiplied. Barefoot men and women trudging through snow in search of divine favor. Yet for every procession, there was also doubt, whispers that God had abandoned them, that prayers fell. Upon deaf heavens, the famine did not destroy faith, but it fractured it, driving some deeper into devotion and others toward bitterness or superstition. Merchants and traders found their fortunes reshaped. Those who controlled grain became powerful. Beyond kings, in Lübeck, the Hanseatic League manipulated scarcity to their advantage, releasing grain at inflated prices. Their ships, heavy with rye, became symbols of both salvation and exploitation. In smaller towns, bakers and butchers walked a dangerous line, for their craft made them indispensable yet vulnerable to accusation. A loaf of bread sold too dearly could spark a riot. Too cheaply, and they starved themselves. Commerce itself bent beneath the weight of hunger, its rhythms distorted by survival's demands. The plague amplified these reverberations. Whole communities collapsed, their survivors fleeing to neighboring towns, spreading both disease and fear. In some regions, labor became scarce, forcing lords to bargain with peasants. For the first time in centuries, wages rose in certain areas, a strange inversion of fortune born of calamity. Winter, famine, and plague together remade the social order, creating cracks through which new possibilities emerged. Cultural life reflected the turmoil. Songs took on mournful tones, speaking of hunger as a beast that devoured villages whole. Folk tales personified famine as a pale woman who walked through fields, touching crops until they withered, or as a black dog that prowled at night, its eyes glowing with hunger. Such stories were not merely entertainment. They were vessels of memory, ways to give shape to an invisible enemy. Children grew up with these tales, learning early that survival was uncertain, that life itself was fragile as frost on a window. Picture a town square in Ghent in the winter of 1349. Snow covers the cobblestones. A grain cart arrives, guarded by soldiers. The crowd surges forward, men and women shouting, coins clutched in their hands. The baker announces the price, higher than any can afford. A woman cries out, accusing him of greed. Stones are thrown, soldiers raise their shields, and chaos erupts. Grain spills onto the snow, trampled underfoot as hands grasp desperately for handfuls. This is not merely hunger. It is society unraveling in real time. The social reverberation of survival's turning point was clear. The bonds of community loosened. Authority weakened, faith fractured, commerce hardened, and culture darkened. Hunger was not confined to the stomach. It spread into law, politics, faith, and imagination. Winter thus became not only a natural season, but a social storm, reshaping Europe in ways that would linger long after the snow had melted. The struggles, of survival in medieval winters when bark was turned into bread and leather into food may seem impossibly distant from the world we know today. Yet the echoes of those turning points still reach us, soft but persistent, reminding us that the human condition has never been free from the tension between abundance and scarcity. If anything, the scale of our systems has grown, and with it, the consequences of their fragility. When we study the chronicles of 1316 or 1348, we find more than curiosity. We find lessons about the limits of resilience. Medieval peasants endured by stripping forests of bark, by boiling weeds, by gnawing on scraps of leather. They survived because they accepted what necessity demanded. Today, our struggles are cloaked in different clothing. In 2020, as a pandemic shook global trade, shelves emptied in cities where abundance had been assumed eternal. People stood in lines for flour, rice, or canned goods, staring at aisles stripped bare. The sight echoed medieval hunger, the shock of realizing that supply could vanish overnight and that survival required adaptation. Energy crises, too, remind us of the old rhythm. In the winter of 2022, Europeans were urged to conserve gas, to lower thermostats, to endure colder homes. The language was modern, but the experience was medieval. Survival depending not on comfort, but on endurance, just as peasants once rationed candles, modern families counted kilowatts. Just as medieval villagers huddled together against frost, city dwellers layered blankets in apartments. Survival still carried the same weight, though measured in degrees rather than in bushels of grain. Climate change adds a sharper resonance. Where the 14th century suffered the chill of the Little Ice Age, our century endures extremes of heat, drought, flood, and storm. Crops fail not from cold but from heat, not from rain alone but from its absence. Yet the pattern remains. Harvests falter, prices rise, and unrest follows. The medieval turning point, when families resorted to desperate measures, has its echo in modern farmers abandoning fields cracked by drought, or in families in fragile nations eating wild roots. When markets collapse, the survival instinct endures, as does the humiliation of being forced to live on what was never meant as food. There is also the echo of dignities surrendered. In the 14th century, proud men who had never begged found themselves at monastery gates, bowls in hand. Today, men and women who once considered themselves secure stand in line at food banks. During crises, humbled by forces beyond their control, survival often requires the surrender of pride, and this truth binds us across centuries. Technology has softened the edge, but not erased it. Refrigerators, supermarkets, supply chains, all are defenses against hunger, yet each can fail. The pandemic, energy crises, and climate disruptions show how quickly certainty can dissolve. In these moments, the echoes of medieval winters return, reminding us that survival is never guaranteed, and that the turning point can come quietly, as it once did in cottages where bark was ground into bread. Yet the most enduring echo is not despair, but resilience. Just as medieval families learned to forage, to invent, to endure, so too do we find ways to adapt, Communities come together, neighbors share, charities distribute food, governments intervene. The instinct to preserve life, to stretch resources, to support one another, remains as strong now as it did 7 centuries ago. The turning point of survival is always also the turning point of solidarity. Imagine a family in 1349 sharing a pot of nettle broth by a dim fire. Now imagine a family in 2021 eating a meal of rice and beans by candlelight during a blackout. Though centuries apart, both share the same human story. The will to endure, the refusal to yield to despair, the hope that tomorrow will be kinder. Survival is not triumph, but it is victory enough. And so, as we close this chapter, the echo of survival's turning point lingers. It tells us that humanity endures not by denying hardship, but by adapting to it, by accepting what necessity demands, by finding strength in unity. The medieval peasants who chewed bark and boiled leather are not strangers. They are our ancestors in spirit, teaching us still how to live when abundance falters. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. By the middle of the 14th century, Europe was not only scarred by hunger and plague, but reshaped by them. The result of those brutal winters and failed harvests was visible everywhere. In villages abandoned, in cities swollen with refugees, in monasteries straining under endless pleas for aid. Survival had not only been a personal struggle, it had been a collective test, and the echoes of that struggle resounded across society long after the snow melted. Villages that once thrived along riverbanks or in forest clearings stood silent. Roofs collapsed under the weight of neglect. Wells filled with debris. Fields overgrown with weeds. Chroniclers speak of whole communities vanishing, leaving only the outlines of foundations beneath moss and grass. These were not merely homes lost, but networks of trust and labor dissolved. A vanished village meant fields left untilled, markets without grain, churches without congregations. The empty spaces became symbols of winter's authority, proof that society itself could be erased by hunger. Cities, by contrast, swelled with the displaced. Refugees poured into London, Paris, Bruges, and Cologne, seeking bread and shelter. The result was a new kind of crisis. Streets overflowed with beggars. Disease spread rapidly in crowded alleys where families huddled in makeshift shelters. Officials attempted to impose order, but hunger was not easily governed. Riots became frequent, sparked by rumors of hoarding or by sudden rises in prices. In Paris, the king's soldiers patrolled the markets. Yet even their presence could not prevent desperate hands from seizing bread. The city, once a symbol of wealth and culture, became a theater where survival played out in chaos. The nobility felt the echo in their own halls. Castles, though still imposing, rang hollow. Feasts grew meager, and servants deserted their posts, either dead from famine or fleeing to towns where wages had risen. Lords who survived found their power shaken. Peasants questioned obligations, some refusing to pay rents, others abandoning lands altogether. The feudal system, built on the assumption of stability, cracked under the weight of scarcity. Winter had humbled kings as surely as it had starved peasants. The church, Long the anchor of medieval life also carried scars. Monasteries that opened their doors became legends of charity, their reputations strengthened. But others, unable or unwilling to give, were remembered for cruelty. Faith endured, but it changed. Pilgrimages multiplied, relics were venerated with new fervor, and yet doubt spread like frost on windows. If God was merciful, why had children starved? If saints interceded, why did disease return each winter? These questions lingered, subtle but corrosive, reshaping the spiritual life of Europe. Commerce, too, bore the mark of famine. The Hanseatic League grew rich by controlling grain, but resentment simmered. Local merchants who profited from scarcity found themselves despised even. As they prospered, markets no longer symbolized exchange and abundance. They symbolized inequality and mistrust. Coins jingled in empty stalls, and prices bore little relation to the value of labor. The echo of hunger was felt in every contract, every bargain. Every loaf sold for more than most could pay. Culture reflected the transformation. Songs became darker, telling of winters when families perished, of fields left empty, of wolves prowling villages. Folk tales spoke of hunger as a specter, a pale figure that walked silently through doors and sat uninvited at every table. These stories were not only entertainments, they were warnings etched into memory, teaching children that abundance was fragile, that generosity could save, that pride could destroy. The echo of famine became part of Europe's imagination, shaping its art, its literature, and its moral sense. Picture the scene in a town square in Bruges, years after the famine had ended. A baker sells bread in modest loaves. The crowd, though calmer than in 1317, still eyes him with suspicion. A woman clutches her coins tightly, her memory filled with winters when bread cost more than gold. Children linger at the edges, watching hungrily. Though the crisis has passed, the echo remains. Every loaf, every coin exchanged, carries the memory of hunger. Society, once fractured, now moves cautiously, haunted by the knowledge of how close it had come to collapse. Thus, the result of those brutal winters was not only measured in deaths, but in transformations. Villages vanished, cities swelled, lords lost authority, merchants gained power. Churches both strengthened and weakened, culture darkened, and memory thickened with fear. The echo across society was profound, shaping how Europe would face the centuries to come. Winter had proven itself not only a season, but a force that left its mark on every corner of medieval life. The echoes that rippled across medieval society in the wake of famine and plague did not rise from thin air. They were the consequences of immediate causes that had gnawed at the fragile bonds of community. Long before the snow fell, to understand why Europe fractured under winter's hand, one must trace the chain of events that weakened its foundations. The first cause lay in agriculture itself. Medieval farming was a delicate balance, never far from failure. Wooden plows scratched shallow furrows into heavy clay soils. Harvests depended on the rhythm of seasons. With no technology to shield against too much rain or too little sun, when the Great Famine of 1315 struck, it was because rains had rotted the crops in spring and summer. The following winters exposed this fragility, sealing away what little food had been gathered. Scarcity, once a local problem, became continental. Communities that had endured ordinary hardship suddenly faced catastrophe together. The second cause was demographic. Europe's population had grown steadily during the High Middle Ages, pressing every acre of land into service. Forests were cleared, marshes drained, but yields remained meager. There was no surplus to cushion failure. A single bad harvest could be endured. Two in succession spelled collapse. When the Little Ice Age shortened summers and lengthened winters, the balance tipped. More mouths than ever demanded bread, while the fields offered less than ever. Hunger became not a misfortune of the poor, but a universal threat. The third cause was the rigidity of feudal obligations. Lords demanded rents even when crops failed. Tithes to the church were collected in grain when families had none to spare. Kings levied taxes for wars fought far from starving villages. These demands stripped households of resilience. Grain that might have sustained families was carted away to fill barns of monasteries or to fund campaigns. Resentment simmered, for famine was not experienced as a natural disaster alone, but as an injustice compounded by human greed. Trade, which might have alleviated scarcity, faltered under the weight of fear and weather. When rivers froze and roads turned to mud, merchants could not deliver salt, grain, or fish. When plague struck, markets closed, ships rotted in harbors, caravans stayed home. Scarcity became not only a matter of empty fields, but of broken connections. Communities that once relied on distant trade found themselves isolated. Their survival narrowed to what their own soil could provide. The immediate cause of society's fracture lay in this isolation. In the sudden absence of exchange that had bound towns and villages together, fear deepened the fractures. The Black Death, arriving in 1347, spread terror faster than contagion. Villages closed their gates. Towns barred strangers. Hospitality, once a sacred duty, vanished. The poor were excluded from cities already groaning under refugees. Scapegoats were sought. Jews accused of poisoning wells, women of witchcraft, beggars of carrying pestilence. Hunger and fear combined to make cruelty respectable. The immediate cause of division was not only scarcity, but suspicion, which severed the bonds of community as surely as famine had emptied its stomachs. Religion, too, played a double role. For some, famine and plague confirmed sermons of divine punishment. Priests urged penance, fasting, and pilgrimages, practices that often weakened bodies further. For others, the church's inability to protect or explain bred out. Monasteries that shared their stores became pillars of faith, but those that withheld were hated. The immediate cause of spiritual fracture lay here, the disparity between a faith that promised mercy and a reality that delivered hunger. Imagine a town like Cologne in the winter of 1317. The rains of spring had ruined the harvest. The barns were empty, and the snow lay thick upon the fields. Refugees crowded the gates, begging entry. Inside, townspeople muttered against merchants who hoarded grain. Priests urged prayer, but processions yielded no relief. Fear spread rumors that outsiders carried curses. Soldiers patrolled, but hunger drove riots nonetheless. This was not collapse caused by winter alone, but by the immediate convergence of weak harvests, swollen population, rigid feudal demands, broken trade, suspicion, and disappointed faith. Thus, the echoes across society were born of these immediate causes. Hunger was the seed, but it was watered by injustice, fed by fear, and grown in the soil of fragile systems. Winter merely revealed what had always been present, a Europe stretched too thin, too dependent on fragile balances, too quick to fracture when tested. The echoes we hear in chronicles are not the sound of snow alone, but the resonance of all these causes striking society together. Every famine, every winter of scarcity, carried within it a moment when hardship passed from private suffering into public upheaval. The turning point for medieval society came not merely when families boiled bark or begged at monastery doors. It arrived when the despair of individuals crystallized into collective unrest. The hunger that began in kitchens spilled into markets, squares, and fields, reshaping the order of Europe in ways no king or council had anticipated. One such turning point unfolded in Flanders during the Great Famine of 1316. Grain had grown scarce, and merchants hoarded their stores, waiting for prices to climb higher still. When carts finally arrived in Bruges, guarded by soldiers, the crowd erupted. Chroniclers describe women shouting that their children starved while the rich feasted. Stones were thrown, soldiers struck back, and chaos filled the square. In the end, the carts were overturned, the grain scattered across the cobblestones. Seized by desperate hands, the riot was not only about hunger, but about justice. It marked the moment when famine ceased to be an accident of weather and became a matter of human choice. Elsewhere, similar scenes played out. In St. Denis, bakers were accused of hiding loaves. Crowds stormed their shops, tearing apart ovens in search of hoarded bread. In London, guards were stationed at mills, for women fought over sacks of flour. These moments were turning points, not because they ended the famine, they did not, but because they revealed the cracks in the social fabric, the hierarchy of lord and peasant, merchant and laborer, priest and parishioner was suddenly contested in the marketplace itself. Hunger gave voice to grievances long silenced. The nobility, too, faced their turning point. In Normandy, peasants refused to pay rents during the famine, declaring that nothing remained to give. Lords who tried to enforce payment met resistance, sometimes violent. Some relented, reducing obligations to keep their peasants alive. Others doubled down, sending soldiers to seize grain, deepening resentment. The turning point lay in this shift of power. Peasants learned that desperation gave them leverage, and lords discovered that authority was fragile when hunger ruled. The Church encountered its turning point in credibility, when prayers and processions failed to bring relief, when relics paraded through streets did not halt the rain or the plague. Whispers spread, faith endured, but its certainty wavered. Pilgrims trudged through snow, flagellants scourged themselves in squares, yet the famine deepened. Some monks shared their bread and were remembered as saints of compassion. Others withheld their stores and were cursed. The turning point came when faith was no longer unquestioned. Hunger revealed the gap between promise and reality, a wound that would fester in later centuries. Trade, too, reached its breaking point. The Hanseatic League, rich in stored grain, tightened its grip on northern Europe. Towns dependent on imports realized their vulnerability. Riots broke out in ports when ships arrived with grain priced beyond reach. Merchants profited, but at the cost of trust. The turning point came when commerce, once seen as salvation, became seen as exploitation. The memory lingered, teaching future generations to view markets with suspicion, to fear that profit might always triumph over mercy. Culture absorbed these turning points in story and song. Ballads spoke of wolves prowling villages where children had starved, of bakers beaten by crowds, of lords humbled by their peasants. Folk tales personified famine as a grey figure who walked into towns, sitting uninvited at every hearth, eating until nothing remained. These stories, born in the turning points of unrest, carried the memory forward. They were not mere entertainments. They were warnings etched into imagination, ensuring that the lessons of hunger would not be forgotten. Picture a January morning in Ghent. Snow falls gently, muting the sounds of the city. In the square, a crowd gathers around a grain cart. Soldiers stand tense, their spears glinting in the pale light. A baker announces the price. Higher than any family can pay, a woman shouts, her voice breaking with anger. The crowd surges. Hands grasp at sacks. Soldiers strike. But hunger is stronger than fear. The cart tips, spilling grain into the snow. Men and women fall to their knees, clawing at kernels scattered across the ground, their tears freezing on their cheeks. This is the turning point, when hunger shatters obedience, when society itself trembles beneath the weight of survival. Thus, the turning point of famine was not only when meals grew desperate, it was when society awoke to its own fragility, when hunger tore away the veils of hierarchy and revealed that order rested on thin foundations. These moments did not destroy Europe, but they reshaped it, leaving scars that endured. Winter had proven itself not only a season of cold but a crucible of transformation, forging new tensions, new doubts, and new voices that would echo for generations. The turning points of unrest and hunger did not fade when the snow melted. They left aftershocks that rippled through society, reshaping the relationship between ruler and subject, merchant and laborer, priest and parishioner. Winter famine was not a season quickly forgotten. Its reverberations lingered like echoes in a cathedral long after the first note had been struck. In the countryside, the feudal order bore deep cracks. Peasants who had once bowed quietly to their lords began to question obligations that seemed unbearable in famine years, when rents were demanded despite empty granaries. Resentment grew. In some regions, men refused to till the land of their lords, choosing instead to wander in search of better terms. Entire villages migrated, leaving fields fallow and manors deserted. Lords, faced with dwindling labor, were forced to offer concessions, reducing obligations or granting freedom to bind tenants to the soil. The reverberation of famine thus began, To loosen the iron grip of feudalism. In towns, guilds rose in strength. Bakers, butchers, and millers, once simple craftsmen, became central to survival. Their control over bread, meat, and flour gave them new power. They organized to regulate prices, to defend themselves from accusations of hoarding, and to negotiate with city councils. Riots revealed their vulnerability, but also their importance. The famine carved out a new balance in urban life, where guilds stood as both protectors and gatekeepers of survival. This transformation was one of famine's lasting legacies. It elevated tradesmen into political actors, whose influence would shape Europe's cities for centuries. The nobility, meanwhile, felt their prestige erode. To peasants, they were seen less as protectors than as exploiters, hoarding grain while others starved. In France and Flanders, uprisings against lords revealed how fragile their power had become. Even in England, chroniclers note villages refusing to pay dues, their defiance unthinkable a generation earlier. Lords who adapted sharing stores, lowering rents retained loyalty. Those who clung to old demands often faced rebellion. Thus, famine revealed that power was not absolute. It depended on a delicate contract of survival. The church experienced both glory and shame. Monasteries that shared grain became legends. Remember their sanctuaries where the hungry found bread. Their reputations endured long after the famine, strengthening their moral authority. Yet others, who withheld stores or preached punishment rather than compassion, bred anger. Faith endured, but it shifted. Some clung to processions, relics, and pilgrimages. Others grew doubtful, muttering that priests fed themselves while preaching humility. The famine did not destroy faith, but it fractured its authority, planting seeds of skepticism that would one day bear fruit in reform. Commerce also transformed. The Hanseatic League and other trading powers, enriched by scarcity, became targets of resentment, but also indispensable. Their control of grain routes revealed how survival now depended, not only on local harvests, but on distant merchants. The reverberation of famine was globalization in its earliest form, an awareness that one's bread might come from hundreds of miles away, and that its price was set not by weather alone, but by market calculation. The resentment this created endured, shaping attitudes toward trade for generations. Culturally, famine left an imprint on imagination. Tales of hunger became parables told by hearthsides. Songs mourned winters when mothers buried children, when fathers left home and never returned. Folklore carried images of famine as a pale specter, a grey wolf, a wandering beggar who entered homes uninvited. These stories functioned as memory, ensuring that the terror of famine was not forgotten. Even in years of abundance, they shaped values, teaching that prudence, generosity, and foresight were virtues, while greed and arrogance brought ruin. The reverberations also touched law and governance. In some cities, councils enacted new rules for storing grain, requiring merchants to keep reserves against future scarcity. In villages, communal granaries were built, guarded by oaths of fairness. The very structure of society adapted in response. To famine's scars, winter's cruelty had forced communities to confront their fragility. and in doing so, it reshaped their institutions. Picture a marketplace in Paris a decade after the famine. Bread is again plentiful, stalls brimming with produce. Yet beneath the hum of trade lies memory. An old woman mutters that she still dreams of nights when she had nothing to feed her children. A merchant carefully weighs his loaves, knowing that a price too high could spark fury. A priest blesses the market, but his words are received with cautious ears. Life has resumed, but the reverberations of hunger remain, etched into behavior, suspicion, and memory. Thus, the famine's echo across society was not a passing sound, but a chorus that continued for generations. It loosened feudal bonds, empowered guilds, weakened nobility, fractured faith, enriched merchants, darkened culture, and reformed law. Winter had been a teacher as well as a tyrant, reshaping Europe not only in death, but in the structures of the living. Its reverberations were the scaffolding upon which the future was built. The echoes of medieval famine and winter hardship are not confined to parchment chronicles or moss-covered ruins. They persist, faint yet insistent, in the way societies today respond to crisis, the forces that fractured Europe in the 14th century's scarcity. Inequality, fear, mistrust still surface when modern systems falter. To trace those echoes is to recognize that the lessons of the past remain alive, and that winter, though softened by technology, still has the power to test societies as it once did. In the Middle Ages, famine eroded feudal bonds, empowered guilds, strained the church, and reshaped trade. In our world, economic and environmental crises perform the same work. When supply chains broke during the pandemic of 2020, workers in warehouses, truckers on highways, and clerks in supermarkets suddenly became essential. Their roles magnified, much like the bakers and millers of 14th century towns. The reverberation is clear. Those who control the means of survival, whether bread, grain, or global shipping, become central in times of scarcity. Their influence rises, their decisions scrutinized, their power resented. Energy crises echo the old grip of merchants. Who controlled grain? In 2022, when war disrupted gas flows in Europe, households once again counted warmth as carefully as medieval peasants counted loaves. Governments urged conservation, industries slowed, and resentment grew against those who profited while others shivered. The dynamic was medieval in its essence. Survival hinged not only on nature, but on human choices, on markets shaped by profit rather than mercy. Winter became once again a test of solidarity, exposing inequality as sharply as any famine centuries ago. Climate change, too, has revived the specter of scarcity. Droughts, floods, and storms ruin crops across continents. Nations reliant on imports find themselves vulnerable, just as medieval towns once depended on distant merchants. Food prices rise, and with them comes unrest. The echoes of Bruges and St. Denis can be heard in modern protests, where crowds demand bread, fuel, or justice. The spark of riot remains the same. The sense that survival is threatened while others hoard or profit. Even faith, though transformed, carries its echo. In the 14th century, Famine and plague fractured confidence in the church. Today, crises stir debates not of relics and penance, but of trust in institutions, governments, scientists, and international organizations occupy the role once held by priests and abbots. Their words can inspire hope or breed doubt. When relief fails, skepticism spreads. The echo is unmistakable. Hunger and hardship always test belief. Whether in God or in human systems, the cultural memory of famine also endures. Stories of scarcity shape imagination. Modern films, novels, and histories return again and again to apocalyptic visions of empty shelves, of families huddled in cold houses, of desperate crowds in city streets. These narratives are not inventions of the modern mind. They are inheritances, echoes of tales told in medieval cottages where hunger was personified as a pale specter or a prowling wolf. Our fascination with collapse is a continuation of that. Old memory, a recognition that survival has always been precarious, and yet resilience is also part of the echo. Medieval communities, though fractured, adapted. They built communal granaries, reshaped labor relations, created new institutions. So too do modern societies adapt. Food banks, relief funds, mutual aid networks, and energy-sharing schemes arise in times of crisis. The echo of solidarity, quiet but enduring, links us to our ancestors who once gathered in smoky holes to divide their last loaves. Picture, for a moment, a medieval village in 1317. Snow blankets the fields, barns stand empty, families gather in silence. Now picture a modern city in 2020, shelves bare of flour and rice, lines stretching outside stores, neighbors texting one another to share what little they have. The centuries collapse in this comparison. The setting changes, the scale enlarges, but the human experience is the same. The anxious search for sustenance, the fear of scarcity, the fragile hope that tomorrow will bring relief. Thus, the echo across society is not only a matter of history, but of present reality. Hunger, inequality, mistrust, resilience, these are themes that bind past and present. Medieval winters teach us that no society is invulnerable, that stability rests on fragile systems, and that survival depends as much on solidarity as on supply. And so, as we close this chapter, let us hear those echoes clearly. They remind us that winter still waits at the edge of every year, that famine still lurks at the edge of every harvest, that society is still tested when abundance falters. The lessons of the past are not warnings for others, they are reminders for us. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. The story of medieval winters is not locked away in the vaults of history. Its results reach us still, whispering through the cracks of modern life. The harsh seasons that once reduced kings and peasants alike to endurance have left behind more than chronicles of suffering. They have bequeathed lessons etched in hunger, frost, and silence that remain relevant in the 21st century. The result of those centuries of cold is not only a memory of famine, but a living reminder of the fragility of human systems and of the resilience that allows humanity to endure. The first and most visible result is caution. Medieval Europe, learned through bitter experience, that abundance can vanish swiftly. Granaries that seemed full in autumn proved empty by February. Villages that celebrated harvest feasts in September buried their children in January. This memory of fragility passed forward, shaping practices of storage, trade, and planning. It is why later centuries built granaries guarded by law, why cities demanded reserves, why rulers measured power not only in armies but in bread. The result of medieval winters was an enduring wariness, a knowledge that nature could never be trusted fully, and that survival required foresight. Another result is humility. Kings who sat in drafty halls learned that stone walls offered little protection against frost. Nobles who feasted in December found themselves rationing peas in March. Monks who prayed for mercy learned that prayers did not fill bowls. These humblings were recorded in chronicles with quiet resignation. The acknowledgement that no wealth, no power, no devotion could banish winter's authority. That humility is a legacy still worth remembering in a world that often imagines itself invincible beneath technology and wealth. The famine and plague also left the result of reform. Communities that survived often did so by adapting, building communal granaries, changing labor relations, revising laws of trade. Towns imposed rules on bakers and millers, limiting prices in times of scarcity. Villages shared oxen and plows, binding themselves together more tightly. Even lords learned to yield, reducing obligations when rebellion threatened. These reforms, born of necessity, shaped the Europe that emerged in later centuries. Winter was not only a destroyer, it was a catalyst for change. But perhaps the deepest result was cultural. The memory of famine seeped into song, folktale, and imagination. Children grew up hearing stories of the pale figure of hunger, of wolves that prowled villages, of winters when even leather was eaten. These stories carried lessons forward: to save in times of plenty, to share in times of need, to distrust greed, to honor foresight. The tales may seem quaint, but they were repositories of hard truth. They kept alive the memory of suffering, so that future generations might avoid its repetition. The echo of these results still shapes us. In times of modern crisis, when shelves empty, when energy grows scarce, when storms darken cities, we find ourselves reenacting old patterns. We ration, we adapt, we fear, we hope. We rediscover humility, solidarity, and caution. This is the truest result of medieval winters. They have given us a template for survival, a deep memory that whispers whenever abundance falters. Picture, for a moment, a medieval family huddled around a fire in 1316, sharing a crust of bark bread. Now picture a modern family in 2021, gathered around candles during a blackout, eating canned beans while waiting for the power to return. The centuries are vast, the details different, but the result is the same. Survival depends on patience, adaptation, and the will to endure together. The story of medieval winters has not ended. Its result is our own resilience, passed to us through centuries of hardship. The lessons we inherit from medieval winters did not appear by chance. They emerged from the immediate causes that forced entire societies to confront their own fragility, just as failed harvests, harsh climates, and rigid systems drove medieval Europe into desperation. So do modern vulnerabilities reveal themselves. When pressure mounts, to understand today's lessons, we must examine the forces that made those winters brutal in the first place. The most immediate cause was nature's indifference. The Little Ice Age shortened summers, chilled springs, and drenched autumns. Crops failed not because men lacked will, but because the skies betrayed them. This unpredictability taught medieval people to mistrust abundance. Even when barns were full, memory whispered that disaster might return next year. The lesson is clear. Prosperity can be undone by forces beyond control. For us, the echo lies in climate change, where medieval people endured colder seasons. We endure extremes, droughts, floods, storms, and heat, just as they learned humility. Before nature, so must we adopt the second cause was dependence on fragile systems. A village lived harvest to harvest, with little buffer. When rains ruined crops in 1315, there were no reserves, no distant warehouses, no safety nets. The famine's severity was not only about weather, but about a lack of redundancy. This fragility echoes in our own time. Modern societies rely on just-in-time supply chains, where shelves hold only days' worth of goods. When ships store, when ports close, when illness spreads, abundance vanishes with startling speed. The medieval lesson warns us that resilience requires more than efficiency. It requires reserves, foresight, and patience. Another cause was inequality. Lords and merchants often hoarded grain, waiting to sell at higher prices. Monasteries sometimes shared, but others withheld. This injustice sharpened suffering, turning hardship into revolt. The famine's cruelty was not only natural, but human. The echo is unmistakable today. When crises strike, the poor are hit hardest, while the wealthy shield themselves with resources. The medieval winters remind us that inequality magnifies disaster, that fairness and solidarity are as vital as bread and fuel. The fourth cause lay in rigidity. Feudal obligations and church tithes persisted even in famine years. Taxes were demanded though peasants starved. Faith insisted on fasting. Even when bodies weakened, institutions refused to bend, and in doing so, they broke trust. Modern parallels abound. Governments and corporations that cling to routine in crisis often deepen the wound. The medieval lesson here is flexibility. Systems must bend with hardship or risk collapse. Fear was also an immediate cause of breakdown. In famine years, strangers were barred from towns, refugees turned away, scapegoats hunted. Hunger bred suspicion. Instead of unity, division flourished. The echo remains in our own time, when crises often spark xenophobia, mistrust, or blame. The medieval winters teach us that fear, left unchecked, fractures society more quickly than hunger itself. Imagine the rhythm of a medieval year. In April, seed was sown. By August, harvest filled barns. In December, families counted their reserves. But when April rains destroyed crops, when barns stood empty by November, winter became a season of reckoning. The causes were visible in every detail. Rotting hay, dying cattle, granaries swept clean. In those moments, lessons were forged. Never trust plenty, never forget hunger, always prepare. Thus, the immediate causes of medieval famine nature's caprice, fragile systems, inequality, rigidity, and fear became the seedbed of lessons that endure. They remind us that hardship is never random. It emerges from vulnerabilities we ignore until winter exposes them. To understand today's lessons, we must look backward, recognizing that the causes that shaped medieval survival are not relics. They are mirrors, reflecting truths we still live with centuries later. Every crisis has its threshold, a moment when inconvenience becomes disaster, when survival requires adaptation rather than patience. In the medieval world, that turning point came in the second or third month of winter, when stores dwindled, livestock weakened, and dignity yielded to necessity. It was then that bark bread was baked, nettles gathered, leather boiled. These turning points of survival were also turning points of knowledge, for they forced people to recognize truths that abundance had concealed. The first truth was that preparation mattered more than pride. Villages that pooled resources, that slaughtered livestock early and salted it well, that rationed grain carefully, these endured. Those that clung to feast days or refused to share perished more quickly. The turning point was not merely about food but about mentality. When people understood that survival meant humility, foresight, and cooperation, not bravado. The lesson carries into our own world. In times of crisis, those who prepare with patience and generosity endure better than those who deny or hoard. The second truth was that resilience required invention. At the turning point, when wheat was gone, families experimented. They brewed thin ale from scraps, made bread from acorns, cooked weeds into stews. These inventions did not emerge in times of plenty, but in desperation. Yet they preserved life. The echo today is clear. Innovation often blooms in crisis vaccines created in months rather than years. New methods of work and trade developed. Under pressure, the medieval lesson is that invention is not luxury but necessity. Forged when survival demands new paths. A third truth lay in solidarity. At the darkest point of winter, communities that shared endured better than those that fractured. Chronicles speak of towns where monasteries opened their stores, feeding hundreds, and of villages where grain was divided equally. They also speak of places where doors were barred, where hoarding led to riots, where fear destroyed unity. The turning point revealed the soul of a community. This too echoes in modern times. During blackouts, pandemics, and storms, neighborhoods that organize mutual aid thrive, while those that retreat into suspicion suffer longer. The fourth truth was that authority depended on mercy. Lords who lowered rents, who forgave dues, who opened barns retained loyalty. Those who demanded obedience while peasants starved faced revolt. The turning point of famine taught rulers that power was not absolute, but conditional on care. This lesson endures. Governments that respond to crisis with compassion secure stability. Those that respond with rigidity or greed invite unrest. The plague sharpened all these truths. At the turning point of famine, hunger weakened bodies. At the turning point of plague, Hunger and disease combined to devastate entire regions. Survival demanded not only food but wisdom, the courage to isolate, the humility to abandon tradition when it endangered life, the willingness to sacrifice pride for safety. These lessons, written in suffering, still guide us in epidemics today. Picture a family in 1317 in a snowbound village. Their last loaf of wheat bread is gone. The father grinds acorns, the mother gathers nettles, the children chew bark softened in broth. This is their turning point, not a triumph, but a recognition survival demands change. Now picture a family in 2020, shelves bare of flour, learning to bake bread with unfamiliar grains, improvising meals from scraps in the pantry. The centuries fall away. The turning point looks different, but feels the same. A threshold where endurance depends on humility, invention, solidarity, and mercy. Thus, the medieval turning points of survival became lessons for all time. They remind us that crisis is not only destruction, but revelation. It reveals what is fragile and what is strong, what must be abandoned and what must be preserved. The bark bread of the 14th century and the improvisations of our own time are linked by the same truth, that survival is not passive, but active, forged in a moment when ordinary life ends and endurance begins. The lessons drawn from medieval winters did not remain confined to cottages and monasteries. They reverberated through the very structure of society, reshaping politics, commerce, faith, and culture. Hunger was not only a private torment, it was a force that redrew the map of human relations, and its echoes are still visible today. In the countryside, famine loosened the grip of feudal obligation. When peasants starved while lords demanded rents, resentment grew into defiance. Some villages refused dues outright, others abandoned the land, leaving fields to weeds and manors empty. This migration weakened noble authority, giving peasants a new kind of leverage. The reverberation was long-lasting. It planted seeds of later revolts. From the Jacquerie in France to the peasants' revolt in England, winter had revealed that obedience was conditional, and that survival came before loyalty. In towns, famine elevated the status of guilds. Bakers, millers, butchers, those who fed the people suddenly found themselves at the center of politics. Riots often targeted them, but their importance was undeniable. Councils negotiated with guild leaders. Prices were fixed. Rules were codified. Hunger made clear that survival depended not only on kings and priests, but on tradesmen. This was a profound social shift. The reverberation carried forward into the rise of an urban middle class, rooted in those who provided essential goods when winters grew harsh. The nobility, conversely, saw their prestige eroded. Once symbols of strength, castles became reminders of inequality. Lords who hoarded grain or raised rents faced rebellion. Even those who shared could not fully erase suspicion. Hunger revealed the vulnerability of their authority. The reverberation of famine was thus a slow decline in unquestioned noble power, a reshaping of Europe toward a society less bound by feudal hierarchy. The church bore its own share of consequences. Monasteries that gave generously became sanctuaries of memory, celebrated in chronicles and folklore. Others, accused of greed, faced resentment. Faith was fractured. Some clung more tightly to relics, pilgrimages, and penance. Others turned away, doubting divine mercy. The famine taught that the Church's authority was conditional on its response to suffering. This reverberation echoed centuries later in the skepticism that fueled reform and reformation. Hunger had made doubt respectable. Commerce grew sharper in its outlines. The Hanseatic League and other merchants thrived by controlling grain. Their ships became lifelines and symbols of resentment at once. Markets revealed the double-edged nature of trade. Salvation for some, ruin for others. Hunger thus exposed the ethics of commerce, a debate that still reverberates. In every crisis, questions arise. Who profits while others starve? How should survival be priced? These questions are medieval in origin, yet modern in urgency. Culture was transformed as well. Songs mourned winters of death, folk tales personified. Famine chronicles spoke of hunger with solemnity. These stories became part of Europe's shared memory, shaping attitudes for generations. Prudence, thrift, charity, these virtues grew from winters of want. Greed, waste, arrogance, these vices were condemned with renewed force. The reverberation of famine thus reached into moral imagination, teaching not only how to survive, but how to judge. Modern society carries these echoes still when shelves empty during a crisis. Suspicion arises. Are merchants hoarding when governments impose rationing? Citizens ask if it is fair. When institutions fail to respond, trust declines. These are medieval patterns replayed in modern contexts. The reverberation is clear. Scarcity always tests the bonds of community, the ethics of authority, and the resilience of culture. Imagine a town square in Bruges in 1317. A riot breaking over the price of bread. Now imagine a modern city in 2022. Protests erupting over rising energy costs. The details differ: loaves and grain in one, gas and electricity in the other, but the pattern is the same. Scarcity presses, anger rises, society trembles. The reverberation of medieval famine hums beneath our present crises, reminding us that survival is never merely personal. It is political, social, cultural. Thus, the social reverberation of medieval winters is not a relic of history, but a living force. It shows us that survival always reshapes society, that hunger redraws relationships, that scarcity tests every institution. The echo is still with us, teaching that resilience must be collective, and that injustice in times of want reverberates far beyond the season of crisis. The winters of the Middle Ages may seem remote, buried beneath centuries of progress, yet their echoes continue to resound in the modern world. The hunger that once drove peasants to boil bark and leather, the riots that erupted in marketplaces, the doubts that corroded faith, these are not merely curiosities of history. They are patterns that reappear whenever abundance falters and systems strain. To listen to these echoes is to recognize that the lessons of survival are as relevant now as they were in 1317. One echo lies in supply chains. Medieval Europe lived harvest to harvest, its survival tied to fragile rhythms of Rain and sun. When the harvest failed, famine struck swiftly. Today, shelves in supermarkets suggest security, but crises reveal fragility. In 2020, a pandemic froze trade, and global shelves emptied of flour, yeast, and rice. The panic buying, the empty aisles, the sudden awareness of dependence, these were medieval scenes replayed with modern props. The echo warns us: abundance without resilience is an illusion. Another echo lies in inequality. Lords hoarded grain while peasants starved. Merchants profited from scarcity while crowds rioted. The pattern persists. In modern crises, the wealthy shield themselves with reserves of wealth, access, and influence, while the poor face the sharpest edge of scarcity. Rising energy costs in 2022 left some homes cold while others remained comfortable, just as resentment simmered in Bruges and St. Denis. It simmers still, reminding us that injustice magnifies disaster. Faith and trust also carry the echo. In medieval times, famine fractured confidence in the church. Some clung harder to prayer, others turned away. Today, when governments, corporations, or international institutions falter in response to crisis, trust erodes. Citizens ask, as peasants once did, who will protect us? Who will hoard? Who will share? Confidence, once broken, does not quickly return. The echo teaches that authority in times of scarcity depends not on power alone, but on mercy and fairness. The cultural echo is just as strong. Medieval folk tales personified famine as a pale specter, a wolf, a wandering beggar. Modern culture mirrors this imagination. Films and novels depict dystopias of empty markets, cold cities, and desperate crowds. The fascination is not fantasy alone. It is memory, carried forward unconsciously. We tell stories of collapse because our ancestors lived them, and because we sense that the possibility is never entirely gone. Yet there is also a brighter echo: resilience. Just as medieval villages survived by pooling grain, by building communal granaries, by sharing oxen and plows, so to do modern communities rise to the challenge. Food banks, relief funds, mutual aid networks, and neighborhood solidarity are not inventions of the present. They are continuations of an old instinct. The echo of generosity, though quieter than the echo of fear, endures across centuries. Imagine a peasant in 1316, carrying his last sack of grain to a communal storehouse, trusting that his neighbors would do the same. Now imagine a family in 2020, donating bags of food to a local pantry, trusting that strangers would benefit. The distance between them is vast, yet the echo is unmistakable. Both acts arise from the same recognition: survival is never solitary. The lesson for today is clear. Scarcity tests not only our bodies, but our bonds. It asks whether we will fracture or unite, whether we will hoard or share, whether we will despair or invent. Medieval winters remind us that the path we choose will echo long after the crisis ends, shaping societies for generations. And so, as we close this chapter, let us carry forward the lessons of the past. Abundance is fragile. Inequality magnifies disaster. Trust depends on mercy. Culture remembers, and resilience endures. these truths, written in frost and hunger centuries ago, are guides for our own uncertain winters. If you are still awake, press 1 in the comments. The journey through medieval winters has carried us from the frozen fields of the 13th century to the echoes we still feel in our own world. We have walked beside peasants boiling bark into bread, stood in markets where riots erupted over loaves, and sat in cold monasteries where monks divided their last rations. We have watched nobles humbled, merchants enriched, priests doubted, and communities reshaped. And through it all, one truth has emerged. Winter was never only a season. It was a teacher, a tyrant, and a mirror held up to society. The lessons it left behind remain alive. Scarcity reveals fragility. Inequality magnifies suffering. Fear fractures trust, and yet resilience endures. Medieval Europe survived not because it was strong, but because it adapted. People shared, improvised, and endured. Out of hunger came reform. Out of despair came resilience. Out of silence came memory. Those lessons, written in frost and hunger, are not relics of history. They are living guides for us in an age where climate, energy, and trade remind us of our own vulnerability. Perhaps this is the deepest echo of all, that we are not so different from those who huddled by dim fires 7 centuries ago. Our walls are stronger, our food more varied, our technologies astonishing. Yet the line between abundance and scarcity remains thin. A storm, a war, a disruption of trade, and the old lessons return. To remember medieval winters is to remember that security is never permanent, and that survival depends as much on compassion and foresight as on resources. As we close this story, let us take with us not despair, but humility. Winter will always return in one form or another, but so too will spring. The memory of famine need not paralyze us, it can strengthen us, reminding us that resilience is possible, that solidarity is powerful, and that even the harshest season passes. So, my friends, if you are still awake, leave a 1 in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to join me on the next journey, where history will once again whisper its lessons through the silence of the past.